Okay, we should probably go ahead and get started again. Okay, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Megan Ferry of Union College, and the title of her presentation is Media and Markets, China-Latin American Relations from a Communications Perspective. Megan?
So that's the bumper, okay. Thank you, Steve, for bringing me out here. Like Tani, I feel a little bit not necessarily misplaced, as you'll see. I don't think I'm misplaced at all in this conference, but I don't necessarily work on subways. But I do work on connections, and subways, as I'll explain, are one way of connecting people's ideas. And in recent years, we can talk about subway culture in China. The subway mobilizes the greater mobility of, symbolizes the greater mobility of people across a geographic space more quickly and with the help of new technology. Here we have, oh, I have to go this way. Old habits are hard to die.
If you hit the down arrow, it should.
Okay, it's down, okay. Mobility of this citizenry, I think, is symbolic of both a geographical and a metaphysical states of being. Rapid transportation of the subway implies both the physical transportation of people from point A to point B through geographic space, and the metaphysical movement from here to there on a cultural map that connects people and things to each other. That is, subways connect people to the world around them. The world is charted by what it means to live in and experience the modern world, and how we get to and maneuver through a modern world by way of a series of developments. That's how we travel, both technological, economic, political, social, historical, and cultural. So the subway and its advertising is a microcosm, or I would call it a site-specific example of a development trajectory. While trains take us from point A to B, we get there riding on vessels of technology. And here's a man in the Beijing subway looking on the map on how to get from A to B. The aggregate content of the space we pass through, not just black walls of tunnels and mirrored reflections of ourselves in the windows, but also the advertising, is the vehicle that acculturates individuals or the riders to the routes that take one to modern development. And here we have an ad in a train for, was it mop.com, which is it's a web portal. It has been proven that constant exposure to repetitive messages, such as those seen in advertising, teach us the social values and knowledges important to achieve development. Advertising plays an important role in consumer capitalist society in order to teach consumption as a necessary asset toward the greater development of capitalist value. In both the physical train of a subway and the metaphysical content of the subway ads, the rider is subject to the pathways set before them. Point A can only be reached through a predetermined series of connections that define the relation between point A and point B. Social norms in consumer capitalist society let us know if we as individuals are on track with mainstream or larger cultural values. And here's an example that I'm sort of pulling, but we can find certainly more in Wenjiabao. This is a little bit time difference, but you have an ad campaign in the Beijing subway for Guangming milk. This is from the Transnational China Project, cite my source. And here's also an ad from Yili Milk ad in 2010 in the Beijing subway. But this also reflects larger cultural values. We have Wen Jiabao in 2007 saying that he wants more Chinese to drink milk. He said this in 2007, but a milk drinking campaign was already underway many years before, and that reflects values of how we create a healthier citizenry and healthier children. So the transnational ads in the subways in today's China blur the lines between what was once thought as local value systems competing against external ones. No longer do we speak of a global-local divide, since globalization itself is in the process of motion, of unfixed and unstable normative cultural codes. My talk will take us out of this micro-level or site-specific view of the subway to see what is happening culturally on a larger scale. I pull back the lens to map a larger trajectory between point A and point B, namely China-Latin American relations. Instead of seeing what transnational effect is happening in China, I want to consider what transnational effect China is having outside its territorial boundaries in order to consider the mutual negotiation of local and global visions of modern development. Central to my inquiry is the notion of development, specifically modern development as a pillar of our modern cultural foundation. Culture, Gertz has taught us, is not an essentialist view of particular habits and customs of a people, but rather a set of control mechanisms, plans, recipes, rules, instructions, and dare I include here maps, for the governing of behavior. These plans orient the individual, help him or her to find his or her bearings. We are dependent on these bearings. They are essential to our existence. As such, our ideas, values, acts, emotions, as well as institutional and architectural structures are our cultural products. Culture does not correspond to innate characteristics of humans, but to the way humans manufacture social relations. My talk today is a cursory example or look at Chinese cultural production via communication strategies abroad, whose messages promote China's development model in Latin America. Since its inception, the PRC has defined itself based on its difference from the dominant worldview. The PRC's international relations have touted a Chinese brand of socialism as a global model of development that is distinct from the West. This vision has always been local, national, and global, international in outlook. And the PRC's recent articulation of the Chinese model, 中国模式, is a Sinocentric view of development and global relations and is rearticulating it since the reform and opening in the last 30 years of how it is different from the West. And here I just give you an example of some of the communication channels that they've come through. This is just a brief overview. That ships carried a lot of the material, the magazines, the picture books, even the acrobatic troops that came over to Latin America. And they came to key central distribution points. Uruguay was one of them. Cuba was for a time before China-Cuban relations were severed. Mail shipments came regularly to Chile, Peru, Colombia in the 1970s. Also, the New China News Agency had offices and stringers in various parts of Latin America, very different countries there. Also, there were radio broadcasts in Spanish and Portuguese, as well as exchanges with film, international affairs, cultural exchanges, and people's diplomacy. Media has played an important role in the transmission of culture that is China's brand of development. In the rest of my talk, I'll devote some time to outlining the forms of media communication and the messages both sent and received between China and Latin America since the 1950s. I suggest that some of the dominant messages, values, symbols that appear in the media messages and their reception, and what I offer here are just fragments or vignettes of the contact between China and Latin American countries. Those who were born, those who have lived abroad for any period of time or grown up in other countries are very aware of the dominant role that Western culture plays on a global scale. Its cultural universalism permeates scientific as well as social engagement. U.S. cultural market and technological dominance significantly influence the nature of our current-day global world, from the influence of the Hollywood cultural industry, dominance of industrial markets, and our military presence worldwide. Chinese messages reached a receptive audience when they reached Latin America, those who were already looking for alternatives to U.S. dominance in the region. In what way, though, does China's development model differ from the dominant Western model? Some of the dominant messages that appeared were that it was support for anti-imperialist struggles in other countries, China was the world leader in that anti-imperialist struggle, and that Mao Zedong thought was the powerful ideological weapon. And China is friendly with nations around the globe. And so there are tons of images that can be used as examples, but I just picked two of them here to show the different contrasting messages. That one is a supporting of revolutionary struggles in a specific country, in the Dominican Republic, and the other one is talking about the friendship, that China is not in any sort of aggressive or antagonistic relationship with its allies. Joseph Nye has taught us that soft power initiatives seek not so much to persuade, but to direct public opinion and garner support for our nation's worldview. He calls soft power an attractive power. So what makes, or what made and continues to make China attractive to Latin America? Why should it be attractive to Latin Americans? And what made China's difference so attractive to others who are looking for new cultural models and worldviews? As they also sought new friendships and communities. And I'll talk about 3 points here of attraction. One is China is attractive as a geographical and ideological destination, as an alternative model for development, and as an equal partner for development. So China is attractive as a geographical destination. Artists, journalists, politicians have traveled to China since the 1950s. There are also reports of anti-imperialist rebel training camps in China, but that's, from what I understand, has not been substantiated. They don't know how many and who all went. But it's safe to say that that friendly travelers friendly exchanges, or let's say exchanges, between journalists and artists and politicians were much more the norm than we know of, as for instance, of sort of guerrilla fighting training, at least publicly. The pictures here come from a journalist, Ricardo Mongru from Peru. These are pictures of, that he took on his trip to China. It was very common as part of people's diplomacy that when journalists or artists came back from China, they would write about China, and they would write books about China. So we have books, reports of China visits from Colombia, from Mexico, from Peru, from Chile, from Argentina. And this is one particular one. And so you think about how those messages were received as China as a friendly place and China as sort of an ideal model. We see here his images of China as smiling. So the pictures are all of the Chinese smiling. Perhaps this is a modern smiling girl. And also modern machinery, remarks on the machinery. And how modern China is. And reports from the interviews that I've had with Colombian and Chilean student revolutionaries involved in sort of Maoist movements, even as late into the 80s, was that China represented for many Latin Americans who were receiving these messages as a kind of paradise on earth. This is where the socialist paradise was being realized. China is also attractive as an ideological destination. Those seeking to counter the effects of U.S. dominance in the region and political conservatism, especially with some of the Maoist youth groups in Colombia and also in Chile. Chinese brand of socialism promised a liberation that existing models couldn't offer. And here we have an armband. This was published in the Peking Review. The Peking Review would often take letters to the editor, and so would publish photos. And this was a photo that someone had sent of a Red Guard armband from Colombia that the Colombians had made, saying, "Long live the Chinese proletariat revolution." This was in 1968. And here we have an author and editor of a Chilean author and editor, Pablo de Roca, who published his journal Multitud. This is in 1963. He wrote an ode to China. China is also attractive as an alternative development model. The Communist Party of Peru, otherwise known as the Shining Path, or the Sendero Luminoso, took China's message most literally in their application of the China model on the Peruvian soil. And I've looked at an earlier work at some of the sort of the visual language and rhetoric, comparing it from the propaganda images that China sent out, and with the Sendero Luminoso, or the Shining Path propaganda images. This is just an example of one, but this is a saying from, I think the battery's gone, the saying that power grows out of the barrel of the gun. They use a lot of Maoist rhetoric, but also a lot of that visual rhetoric. They borrow a lot of that rhetoric in their work. But in general, Chinese socialism, and here's another example of the masses make history, the party directs them. In general, Chinese socialism was attractive to Latin American peasants and first-generation urbanites, as well as indigenous populations. Former student revolutionaries, so not all turned violent like the Sendero Luminoso or terroristic. Most of them, many of them who were formerly attracted to Maoism in the 60s and 70s, who were former student revolutionary leaders, are now university professors and national presidents, and also in business executives. And so we're seeing them in different social spaces within their own contexts, and be interesting to see how they respond to China today. China is also attractive as a spectacle. And I think Arif Durlik has talked about that, about Orientalism and self-Orientalism of China, but it's a spectacle for its uniqueness. It's the strange and the foreign, while it's also the strange and foreign then become knowable. And this is a 1982 film called Romance on the Silk Road. And this comes out of the fact that in the 1970s, briefly, Zhou Enlai realized that some of the messages were not getting across the way he wanted them to with China globally. And in the 1980s, that was past Zhou Enlai, but in the 1980s, there was a recognition that they needed to do more focus groups to have a greater understanding of the audience, who were receiving the messages from China. And so they changed focus from just selling out China to see more what the audience, the receivers, were interested in. And this was one of the popular films. This film was distributed globally in the 1980s. A very popular film. It was also redone for the 2008 Olympics in China. So it's a film that still has currency today. I think it was done as a show, not as a film. This is also a result of what other exchanges that went to China, was the tourism, acrobat troops, song and dance troops, which we now have information about who went over. Paper cuts and Chinese crafts were very popular. I spoke with a Medellin distributor in Medellin, Colombia, who took book orders from China, and he said the most popular books were cookbooks and children's literature. So not as much a lot of the revolutionary material, but more so the cookbooks. And many Colombians that I speak to believe that their cooking has changed as a result of these cookbooks. I think it's specifically in terms of rice. A Chilean barber who from the south, southern Chile, was not a Maoist, probably a Christian Democrat, had Peking Review in his waiting area because the customers demanded it. It didn't have any ideological meaning for him. It was just the customers were interested in reading that material, so that's where it appeared in a southern Chilean barber shop. These crafts were sent. Many of the former student revolutionaries that I spoke to in Chile and Colombia loved collecting the crafts, the paper cuts, the things that were offered for free, the postcards or things that you could send away for that would appear in these magazines, and they collected them. And many of them would tell me about how they had collected a whole wall full of materials, but when there was a political crackdown on student revolutionaries or on leftist activities, the government's either burned these materials or the students burned these materials themselves so they wouldn't be incriminated. But they do speak very fondly of these materials, these objects that they have lost. China is also attractive for economic development. China was willing in the 1950s and 60s to overlook the revolutionary rhetoric in order to establish economic ties. It was willing to accept business deals before political recognition. An interesting note was in Chile they established official business and friendship ties in 1965, but did not establish formal diplomatic ties until 1970. And a Chilean colleague of mine tells me that Salvador Allende, who was left Li Ning was not necessarily interested in China for its revolutionary rhetoric as much as the thought of having every Chinese person drink 1 cup of Chilean wine. And talking about in terms of ideological responses in return, with the coup, overthrow of Allende and the rise of Pinochet, that China recognized Pinochet and saw no contradiction in that. And Deng Xiaoping went before the United Nations to state that. And that's when those media messages, at least for the revolutionaries, the Chilean revolutionaries at the time, broke with China. In general, they thought the Red Book was too dogmatic. They preferred on contradiction. But after China's recognition of Pinochet, there was less interest in sort of the China-Latin American connections for leftist revolutionaries or leftist activists. So Chinatown, in terms of its attraction for economic development, we also have here in 1993, there's an image of President Frei in Chile, positioning himself very specifically on the coast, the Chilean coast, with the Pacific horizon in the background, and not necessarily naming China, but saying it's our new frontier. And then we also have in 1996 that Chile was one of the first consulates, Latin American consulates established in Shanghai. And that goes back to its long ties, its long business ties. So the effect this is having with China's economic development is it's reviving local markets, it's reviving local Chinatowns in Lima, Peru, in Mexico City, and in Havana, Cuba. Even if there are not the political ties there, we have the interest in these market ties that are resurging. And also you're having a creation of new communities, charting new maps with the new economic alliances with APEC, BRIC, and the China's Latin American Chamber of Commerce. So we have to keep in mind that these messages were picked up by people who were already had a selected attention, and they were also looking for alternatives, because these messages appeared alongside other media messages. And this is just an example from a Peruvian newspaper called Caretas, and this is showing this. It's a picture here. In this picture, these are women, indigenous women from Ayacucho, with a sign up here that says Revistas Chinas, Chinese magazines. So these Chinese magazines were on sale, but we see also other kinds of fragments of other different advertisements that were there. So we have to see this in context. And this is a newspaper, and this is, I think, Julio Iglesias, who's actually almost pointing to the Revistas Chinas, where you can also study English. But this is also the Caretas. This was in 1981. This was after the Sendero Luminoso, Shining Path, launched its sort of, what do we call it? It's launched its terror in 1980, and this is a response to it. And so this magazine is actually trying to put both the Chinese magazines, but also what was happening with the Shining Path in a different kind of context. So messages, and this. Oh, sorry. We'll say that this is in context. When we look at some of these contexts of what happens, and this is what happens when these messages get detached from the senders. And this goes back to the 1980. In 1980, when Sendero Luminoso, Shining Path, launched its terror in Peru, in Lima, the world, or Lima at least, and the world woke up to dogs hung from lamp posts with signs saying Deng Xiaoping, hijo de puta, son of a bitch. And what does Deng Xiaoping have to do with this Shining Path organization in Peru, in Lima, Peru, in this time? Well, that also announces for the Sendero Luminoso the break of that ideological break between China and Maoist ideology. So this is where a message is in effect getting detached from its sender. This is sort of an obvious one, but there are ones that you can look at later. Certainly Maoism has global currency separate from the CCP and China now, and this is from revolutionary movements. Even as Shining Path has sort of lost its momentum, it's still active, but lost its momentum in Peru, you still have Maoist movements that have moved more in the virtual world. There was a meeting more recently in Stockholm, Sweden in 2010. But even in the virtual world, when I was starting this research in early 2000, I could find a lot of materials on the web, and now I can find very little. And I believe it's because a lot of these Maoist organizations are now named as terrorist organizations, and so they've moved underground. So it's created different kinds of networks. Here's an example of celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Chinese Revolution in Medellin, Colombia. Sort of a faded place on a street, a street in the city, but it seems to be detached from its referent. It no longer has the same kind of power, same kind of force that it maybe once had. Excuse me, sorry. One of the things about these messages moving about, we're also seeing competition with these other messages. So we saw the message here of what was happening in this, in the Maoist, with sort of the kind of a virtual Maoism or Maoist groups or Maoist cells operating in different places. But we also have it being contained in Peru itself with the Truth and Reconciliation Museum, which is a museum that to address the 10 years of terror that both terrorists, the Shining Path, and the state inflicted on its peoples. And they have a museum dedicated to the Shining Path and the leader, Guzman. And in that room they have with Guzman, they have also a lot of his Maoist visual propaganda that was used to help support his ideas and his equations there. So with the China model now revived, is now being more commercial, more consumer-oriented, and less revolutionary. What kind of foothold does it have in a Latin American imagination? There are critiques now about labor markets, labor practices, and the economy. There's critiques about dumping practices. I think 3/4 of many of the dumping lawsuits that are occurring in most Latin American countries are directed at China. Barbarita Cardoso is a Colombian artist who was studying in London and won was it a Red Mansion Foundation grant to bring artists to China. She was in residence there for 6 months and created these artistic works that talk about labor and production. This is talking, and certainly what's happening in the market. Things on sale meaning not just for sale, but on sale. This is done on traditional Chinese scroll, silk scroll, and also sort of talking about sort of prices, sales. And here we have all image. She's done paper cuts. I couldn't get a closer image. Paper cuts, and on her paper cuts, traditional Chinese paper cuts, she's included the logos of the different brands like Nike and Gap who are involved. So that would be another way to look, another avenue to begin to look at what's happening in China. So what is currently separating China and Latin America is not just the geographic, but also linguistic divides. Shipping lanes for products go via Miami instead of directly to Cartagena. Planes often go through LAX, Los Angeles, instead of Santiago, although there are talks about trying to build these more direct routes to Latin America. There are increasing cultural exchanges. There are Confucius institutes that have been established in various Latin American countries, but there needs to be more personal exchanges. In 2008, at the 50th anniversary of the China Central Television, top CCP member Li Changchun stated that whoever advances in telecommunication ability and technology will be able to influence the world with their cultural beliefs and values, hence exercising a stronger influence in other countries. So in the last 30 years, China has promoted the localization of Chinese media abroad, expanded into foreign TV sectors, and in general stepped up its marketing of Chinese development model to a global population. And I'm going to speak to two examples here as I conclude. In 2004, CCTV, China Central Television, launched a Spanish broadcasts. And on the Spanish broadcasts, you have various shows. Most of the shows are about business, sports, China, cultural vignettes about China and Chinese life, dialogues in Spanish with different government offices or politicians or economists that come through, as well as documentaries about social life and social advances within China, and also telenovelas. which for Latin Americans are very popular soap operas. And as you know, we may not know about this as much in the United States, but the telenovela, the Latin American telenovela, is a global model that has been also exported to China. Betty la Fea, Ugly Betty, was broadcast in China, and China CCTV Español is trying to broadcast their telenovelas, broadcast into the Spanish, make it attractive for Spanish-speaking audiences. But it remains to be seen how attractive such things as these Chinese soap operas can be when they're competing against the very strong telenovela or soap opera market. And this is an example here from Negociada China from Brazil, which was a very popular television soap opera that featured a Chinese businessman in there. And it was by Global Television, and Global Television is the main media mogul in Brazil. So China has worked on its branding. But what I'm saying is there's a branding, this is a continuation of a branding that's been going on for quite a long time. In a sense, it's nothing new. We're seeing some revisions of messages, some fine-tuning and tweaking of messages. We certainly have, and I've yet to get hold of it, maybe it's not yet out, there's a national publicity campaign that was supposed to be launched this October 1st to show China, to be shown in embassies worldwide, and then also these short vignettes to be shown and broadcast. Mostly they're targeting CNN and BBC, not necessarily targeting specifically Latin American countries that I know of, but I don't know. And then there's certainly with the Made in China commercial that came out last year that seeks to show China as both global and local, as equal. And I'll just briefly show it here. You can see it. It should work. Oh, you don't see, okay.
When it says made in China, it really means made in China, made with the world.
And so what I didn't include here for the sake of time were these other clips, for instance, from The Romance on the Silk Road. And if we look at those other clips of China or these sort of documentary images or that's being projected, we have the traditional Pipa music or the Arha music. We have some traditional Chinese music, some traditional Chinese images. In fact, we can see those traditional images today in the Democratic and Republican campaign ads that are circulating as we speak. And what this Made in China ad is doing is specifically moving away from that kind of self-orientalizing and saying that this is China made with, I think it's with European styling, made with engineering from Silicon Valley as a way of creating, of recrafting this message of working within the community. So what I've offered here today are just some brief vignettes, fragments of some of the work that I've been doing of these different kinds of global connections, advertising, and new cultural communities. So thank you.
Questions?
I wonder if you published this material.
I did a preliminary article in the early 2000s that looked at Maoist, looked at China as a sort of socialist utopia and for Latin Americans, for specific Latin American movements like the Shining Path. And I looked at the visual rhetoric of how we saw that. But I have not yet done something like this today. This is Steve Lewis who's asking me to come back and sort of recraft some of the work that I've been sitting on for a while. So hopefully it will be coming out sometime soon. Yes?
How has the visual rhetoric changed in presenting images of sexually transmitted diseases, gay, lesbian, bisexual, gendered, one child per family, issues of sex and disease? What education and propaganda mixture for health gets conveyed now?
That's a fantastic question. That I don't know, because I don't look specifically at those kinds of public health campaigns or advertising within China itself. And I don't know of if there are sort of global public health campaigns that China is doing on sort of GLBT issues, HIV/AIDS. I'm not aware of those, and I would have to defer to my colleagues here who are more familiar with what's going on within China now on these kinds of campaigns. Mm. It might be interesting that China might then take up that, especially not necessarily public health, but sustainability. And so it'll be quite interesting to see, as China's branding itself as a green China, if we'll begin to see this kind of campaign that's global as well as local. And I have not looked yet at that sort of global local.
Are there any metrics that you could use to measure the impacts of this? I mean, I just think of South. The number of people that watch CCTV versus watch, say, European or American channels. Yeah. The number of people that go to a movie from China. It would be interesting to know whether these are having any effect.
That's right. It's very difficult to know. I'm trying to find data right now on what the programs were, who went, what programs actually went over, who went over, what was shown, when, and it's very difficult to get that information. And it's also different to get the information both from the China side and also from the Latin American side. This is what's so ephemeral about this, is that it didn't seem to be worthy enough to record. I think, though, with looking at CCTV Español, CCTV in Spanish, I think we could probably do some look at some viewers. I know about it because of South American friends here in the United States who watch CCTV Español, and they come back and they say, look at this show, it's así es China, this is China. So I only know that anecdotally, and so I don't know what kind of viewer response is, how effective this media is. Certainly putting it out on a website does not necessarily guarantee that someone is going to be watching on the other end. And it's not just on a website, it's also on the cable channels. So you can actually, when you order it, at least here in the United States, it's on the cable channels. If it's on the cable channels in Colombia or in Chile, that's something that I need to know, and that would have to be working with people that work on viewer responses, and but that would be very interesting to know.
I can tell you CCTV in English is not very interesting.
but it might,
for a few small group of people.
That's right, and it might be for a few group of people. And so what these vignettes that I've shown you are these vignettes of these different people in different spaces. Barbarita Cardosa is a young woman. She was not a part of the student revolutionary movements in the 70s and 80s, so she didn't collect this sort of handicraft and paper cut materials when she was younger, but was she around somebody who did? Or is it something that's sort of ongoing and sort of that China messages of these paper cuts, which are ubiquitous? Is that just a message that she keeps repeating? And then there's so many individual trajectories that one can take. Her take on the media messages would be something very different from somebody else. Or even in Chile itself, there was just some. I've just got hold of a published material that has different Chileans' responses to China, and it pairs leftists, former leftist activists, with the daughter of Pinochet, who also went to China, and they all talk about how wonderful China was in their experience. So even people from these different ideologies who you think wouldn't be connecting are somehow, in some ways, converging on certain messages, but not on all. Yeah, that's. I'm just opening another can of worms for more research for a wonderful graduate student.
Yes, Megan, I love your presentation. All of the presentations here have been essentially visual, but I noted in the Made in China video, just a brief clip, the music was really interesting, and I wondered, if you've looked into that kind of realm of exchange too, because it's sort of interesting both ways.
Yes, one of the former student revolutionaries I spoke with in Colombia said that her band was inspired by a lot of Maoist thought, and a lot of the music that they created. They had a student band, and I tried to get hold of that material. Unfortunately, that was part of the stuff that was burned. So it's lost to us. But we see examples of it. I mean, we see, for instance, Rage Against the Machine that has a song that came out when they first came out, supporting the Shining Path. So we can see snippets in there, and we certainly have sort of, especially with hip-hop and Brazilian hip-hop, so we can sort of trace that with musically, and that'd be a fantastic thing to do. Also for a musicologist graduate student, I think would be fantastic. But yes, I think that these doors open to these larger connections, and there are connections to be made there, for sure. Yeah.
Maybe not quite closely related to what
your topic is, but you didn't mention those Maoists now, professors, leaders, or even business people. They are doing whatever against Maoism. I'm wondering, because to me this is a very painful experience when the West, Latin American people or Japanese people, they thought Maoism was so great that we were suffering.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how these people would rethink about Maoism today. Because there is a very interesting episode recently. The new Prime Minister of Japan was once a Maoist. When he assumed his office, the Chinese Maoists were so happy. Now we'll have wonderful relationship. But he's the one to order this very hard relationship now between China and Japan. It was so funny. And just one.
Well, yeah, and those are part of my long night discussions with my Latin American friends about specifically what's happening there. I mean, certainly Maoism, like any other sort of fundamentalist ideology in that sense, is very rigid in its classification of what constitutes that culture, right? And so for some that interpret it as a right, not just the right to rebel, but the right to be violent. Which is we certainly saw in China, which we certainly saw with Sendero Luminoso in Peru. But we don't necessarily see that, and we see that with the was it RAF, the Rote Armee Faction in Germany, the Baader-Meinhof group that interpreted it as a right to be violent. But that's not a message that Maoists around the world necessarily took. They took it as a right to revolt, but not and to rebel, but not necessarily a right to be violent. So that's where also that message also was interpreted differently. There is, certainly in Latin America now, we're seeing increasingly more leftist governments, or more governments that are not necessarily as tied to the United States as they had been in the past. I think Colombia is one of the few remaining sort of U.S. allies, which is the reason why U.S. is putting, I think it's 5 military bases in Colombia as a way to sort of also pan out and look at what's happening in the region. We have Evo Morales, we have the Kirchners, Evo Morales in Bolivia, Kirchners in Argentina, we have Chavez in Venezuela, and Lula in Brazil, who are not necessarily looking to follow a U.S.-centric model. And so how much does that necessarily, Maoist as an ideology or Maoist as a practice plays in a role? You know, that's also worth looking further and looking more directly at their materials and what they've written. Yep.
Do you happen to know who wrote and produced the Made in China ad? Was that done in China, or was that done by some Avenue company?
It was done in China, in Shanghai. It's Low and S has the name.
Actually, for the ministry, I think it's Ministry of Commerce, together with four trade associations.
Yes.
Did that? It was also placed at CNN.
It was placed on CNN and BBC.
And in Asia as well. And so actually spend tons of money on this, and then they really expect, this is the first ever commercial that target outside audiences that was produced by the government agencies.
But it was produced by Chinese in China.
In China.
They didn't hire a U.S. company to do it for them.
New York City.
No, but I believe the agency that was used in Shanghai is
based in China, but they were transnational.
They're transnational agencies.
In China. Yeah.
So headquarters in New York, I think.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Anyway,
And I believe that's the same thing that's happening out of Shanghai with this new national publicity ad. And that's what a lot of people who've been working on advertising in China have spoken about. Even if it comes from the location China, it doesn't necessarily mean it's China made. In that, especially with advertising, it's much more transnational. So you have a lot more sort of messages even coming in within the ad agencies themselves, and those ideological messages or cultural messages and values that they want to share.
Yeah, I do have a question about, because most of the discussion this wonderful discussion with her was actually focusing on the Pacific coast of South America. And I'm wondering, what about the other side, in Argentina and Brazil? Is it the reason that so much of the discussion is about what happened in the Pacific coast is because it was dependent on trade ties, and flowing of, and that was just that much farther away. It was considered to be a more remote market, whereas it really is that most of the influence that China is having was on the Pacific coast.
That's a really good question, and that I think speaks to right now the limits of my knowledge, because I haven't necessarily been looking at Argentina and Brazil, so I can't really speak to that.
It'd be interesting to look.
That would be fascinating to look at. Yes, absolutely, you're right.
I have a question about China's soft power.
Yeah.
You used Joseph Knight's definition of what soft power is. It's really about attraction, and he also talks about how it's really about how to persuade the other side, the other party, to do what not is necessarily in their interest. So I just wonder if you have seen any case that the Chinese government or even Chinese companies are able to do things that can co-opt the locals to act in a way that they want them to act. Because the Chinese government definitely now is really interested in branding itself globally. So that's why they set aside a large amount of money in order for CCTV and the Xinhua News Agency and the Shanghai Media Group to do global campaigns, and also of course Confucius Institute. And so I just wonder how that is received. And another question is about really the Confucius Institute. So I just wonder how the Confucius Institute is received, because obviously there is this kind of hierarchy according the region hierarchy according to Confucianism, and women is not part of the picture. And so I just wonder how you feel.
Those are fascinating questions. When I spoke to some professors, university professors, former student activists in Colombia, what was attractive to them about China was the role of women. And women holding up half the sky, and that became very part and informative, and part of even how they even structured their Women and Gender Studies department. I think, from what I understand, that the way messages received are also very local. So I can't even speak in terms of a national level of Colombia. I met the wife of the former student revolutionary leader, who was the president of a university, who loved, all she could talk to me about was acupuncture. She actually became an acupuncturist, and how wonderful Chinese medicine was. But that was the message she received. She bought the Chinese medicine manuals, and then went and studied medicine. So even within country specifics, we have to even look at what's happening and how these messages were received individually. I have not been to the Confucius Institutes, or since they've been established in some of these Latin American countries like Chile, Colombia. I think there's one also in Argentina. I haven't been there, and so that would be also pointing towards future research. I'm seeing a little bit of reflection just in the sort of the cultural reflection, and so what I've pointed to today are more so these cultural reflections of how people respond in their literature, in their poems, in their artwork, in their films. We're seeing that a little bit in Africa with some Chinese African filmmakers that are talking about sort of the presence, so China's economic presence in Nigeria, for example, or what remains ideologically of Maoism in Kinshasa, right? And what's happening there with the Kinshasa government, with the different sort of ideological trajectory. And so I'm seeing it more from those sort of artistic responses than an actual, but that would be also future research. And a very good question.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to now ask our next speaker, Dr. Geneva Henry, who is the director of the Center for Digital Scholarship here at Fondren University. Okay.
Thank you.
There we go.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Wow, what a great group. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to you. Megan said she felt like she was moving, a little bit afield of what the group talked about. Well, I'm like way over here. Although I think I may be able to tie in a bit more after your talk with Latin America in a project I'm going to talk with you about. I'm with the Center for Digital Scholarship at Rice, and what I'd like to start with, let's see. Try this one. There. Is just give you initially an overview of what that center is and what we do and why you would even care about it. And then talk about a collection that we have in our digital archive called the Rice Ephemera Collection, which is Steve's collection of ephemera, as an example, and then launch into a project called the Our Americas Archive Partnership. And what we plan to do in using that as a framework for moving forward with presenting a new approach to pulling collections together that are related and also international in character, and then just go through a summary. So the Center for Digital Scholarship at Rice, what we're here to do is support Rice faculty and teaching needs, research needs, really focused on the digital end. As scholarship moves more and more towards the web and towards digital, the traditional approaches to disseminating that knowledge can sometimes go by the wayside. So what is being done to ensure that that knowledge is going to be here 10, 15, 50 years from now? When you move into the digital world, when you start moving away from print, there's a lot of power, there's a lot you can do, there's a lot of scholarship that now is created digitally and never sees print. In digital movies, digital images, as we've seen today, you know, a lot of digital images out there, especially when you're capturing something like ephemera. Part of the challenge when you start to look at what's been captured is that when you go back to find the physical artifacts, they are no longer around. It's a nature of medium that people haven't thought about keeping around for the long term, but as you certainly see, it's critical for scholarship in the research that's being done. So what my center does is we think about how to keep that around for the long term, how to disseminate that more widely so it has a great impact, and how do we provide all of the services that are needed for faculty and students as they're doing this work. Helping them with making multimedia resources, how to scan properly, how to create digital videos that can deliver information in a new way that print can't do, and then how do we archive all of that and then work as a partner with the faculty and the students to have a big impact with those digital resources. Okay, so I'm going to switch over now. Let's try a live demo. I've got screenshots as a backup, so let's see if we can go down onto the web and actually look at some of the materials out of the archive. The Rice Ephemera collection currently is in our test archive, very close to being released to the production. All right. So let's see. I don't have my little scroll bar that I'm used to on the mouse. All right. So we've been working with Steve. We were delighted when he came to us and said, you know, I've got these images and I was wondering if there's anything you can do because I'm afraid they're going to get lost. There's no long-term support for any of this, and he wasn't going to get into the business of being a server farm to make sure that the images would be migrated over time and accessible and maintained on servers that would be available 24 hours a day and available for global reach. So in our institutional repository, which is based on a software platform called DSpace, we commit to keeping the scholarship that we house in there available long-term, and we will do for supported collections and supported content. We will do the long-term migration to make sure that in 20 years it's still there. Provide a permanent identifier for it. It's called a handle in this system so that you can always reference that, and as you move across servers, you don't have to worry about that identifier becoming obsolete. So we currently have 4,526 items in this repository, and many of them have more than a single image associated with them. And these are, I believe, all images that are in here. Photographs that have been taken by Steve and the students for over what period of time?
This is just 98 to 2003.
Okay. So, and there's more to come. So I'm sorting by title because to put content into this repository, there's only one required field, and that's title. So if it has a title, I know that we're going to get to it. Let's see, there's a lot of interesting content in here. This is an example of one of the items. It's a single item in the repository, but it has 4 separate images associated with it. And in the system, when you go into it, you'll see a short description. If you know what you're after, you can go straight to the images. What we've done in working with Steve, though, is provide the metadata for all of this content so that we've got some additional information in there, information that's going to help with the discovery of these assets on the web, and information that's going to help us in the long term as we migrate over time, certain information that we'll need to know to make sure that the integrity of the content is maintained. Can take a look. These early images, unfortunately, are not high-resolution images, and we've talked about that. I think the newer ones will be higher resolution. Yeah. So when we have the high-resolution images, there's a lot we can do. What we're starting to do with all of our high-res images now is make JPEG 2000s of them, which will allow users to not only see the image on their browser, but really zoom in close. So for scholarly use, this is really valuable because you can zoom right in there and see an awful lot of detail with it. So this is just an introduction to the archive, and what I'd like to talk about next is the Our America's Archive Partnership Project. So I'm going to bring that up, and this one, I'll bring the slide up that will be going into live production a little later this week. And this is a project that was motivated by faculty members here who are looking at the Americas from a hemispheric perspective. So this is where it starts to tie in with what Megan was talking about, when you start to understand the influences beyond a single nation state. So I understand your focus is on China, and what the scholars I worked with where their focus was understanding the influences of these various cultures on each other across the Americas, so that you're not looking at any single nation state when you look at the Americas. And the way you begin to understand what's going on across the Americas is when you look at it and the influences from a broader perspective, from a more global perspective. And through this, they're able to generate new understandings from old literature that's been written and classified from these nation-state perspectives. It's discovering new knowledge out of content that was actually published, hundreds of years ago. So we worked with a scholar here, Carolyn Levander, who's the director of the Humanities Research Center, and some of her colleagues, one at University of Maryland, who had developed a collection called the Early Americas Digital Archive, where there were selected transcriptions of critical resources for this field of Americas studies. And then additionally, we worked with Instituto Mora in Mexico City, who had some very interesting collections, but no infrastructure to support this. So we partnered with them, and we actually are housing their digitized resources. But in trying to understand, what we would do with the Americas project, the question was, do we really just want to present this content out of each archive? And the answer, of course, was no. So what we wanted to do was for the scholars who work in this field, give them a resource that would allow them to discover the content that's relevant to their studies through a common interface and not care what what repository it was coming out of. So that's what we built with the Americas Project. We built this interface that would pull together content from multiple archives, not rehost it into a single archive, but leave it where it is so that we could scale over time, add new archives that came along, and we've already had a number of requests from folks who have found out about the project to add content from their archives. But keep it at the original source institution so that when scholars do discover the information, they know where the source resides, and that's where they'll go out to. So as you start to look at content, when you start doing searches and you go to the source material, you start seeing the interface change dramatically because it's not hosted in a single platform. So we have multilingual documents in here. We've done, with our funding from IMLS, we were able to do some translations of some of the Spanish documents into English. We've done a little bit of English into Spanish. Ideally, we would like all of the languages translated across all the other ones. We currently have English, Spanish, Portuguese, and French as languages in the repository. So as we started to build this, one of the first things that came up was that Carolyn Levander said, you know, the vocabulary we use doesn't conform to what you guys talk about in libraries. It's like, oh, really? She said, yeah, those Library of Congress subject headings are totally meaningless to us. And you can put those in there if you want, but it doesn't mean anything to our community. So what we came up with was a set of tags, a set of concepts that were key for that discipline. She and her colleagues got together and said, these are the terms that we care about. I don't know how well that comes across. Is that looking really fuzzy? Okay, let's, yeah. So I'll read some of them. Good suggestion, Steve. So, and it's a limited number. Borders, colonialism, conquest, conservatism, constitutionalism, jump down, race relations, slavery, neo-constitutionalism, inter-American relations, gender, historiography. So these are the terms they care about. If you look up these resources, you know, in a library catalog, these are not the terms that get the subject terms that get associated with the resources. So it was really important that they have the terms they care about. And then, in addition, we wanted people to be able to add their own concepts. So in our testing, we've added a couple, and actually, this turns out a legitimate document. Talks about mosquitoes. So the tagging was really important, and that would allow somebody to browse the archive if they didn't know what they were looking for. If they know what they're looking for, we have a search bar, and somebody can go straight into that and start searching. I'm going to go ahead and just let's browse on slavery just to show you then the power of what you can do, and then. That will bring back a list of documents. So it shows us actually that we have 65 documents in there that have the term slavery, the concept slavery associated with it. We can view that as a list of documents. We can view the results according to a timeline because researchers oftentimes really only care about documents occurring within a given period of time, and that's scrollable. You can go backwards and forwards with that. Another thing we did is also allow people to view it on a map. And the green arrows indicate that there are multiple documents associated with that. This is coming in with mixed reviews from the scholars. It looks cute. And I think that's probably the best way I can describe it at this point. We find high school teachers find this more appealing. The serious scholars, however, when you get down to the genuine utility of this, don't find it very useful. We did make sure that because of the way we're treating the materials, we got rid of all the borders. So we're using Google Earth, but you'll see it's doing it borderlessly. Otherwise, they would have been very upset. So. So we can go through in our search over here and refine the search in any number of ways, including Library of Congress subject headings. And that will give you a full drop-down list that you can choose from if you want to further refine according to that. We had catalogers go through and work with all of the resources and assign standard library terms to them. Let's see. Another aspect of what we have is called educational materials. So if I want to see these educational materials, what they are is scholarly descriptions, or at least pedagogical descriptions of the resources with some context wrapped around them. So the resources themselves are great for scholars to get to and to use in their research. If you want to provide some context, some background to it, which can vary depending on what it is you're teaching, what specifically you're doing research on, then creating a connections module. And connections is just a set of tools for developing and distributing educational materials freely. I could go into a whole lecture on connections, but that's not what we're about here. But they do have this support where we can go in and, for this project, create what we call a lens and just pull up all of the modules that we've created for this project. So we've created 33 to date. I'll just pull up one of them and show you how it relates then to the content in the repository. So with this, and anybody can create content in this repository. You don't have to be at Rice. It can be on any topic you want. But in this particular module, somebody's gone in and actually, given some description of a global view of disease, yellow fever, and the Panama Canal. They have referenced some of the materials in the Our Americas Archive Partnership repository, and they've also identified materials outside of that. You can identify associated web materials. They've included a little map, just whatever they would need to make this relevant, and then be able to point people to source materials. I happen to know that the Journal of George Dunham does reside in the repository. So when I click on that, it will actually take me to Rice's repository where this resides. So this is the short record for that particular journal. We have a lot of metadata associated with this particular collection. So if you were to look at the full record, you'll see an awful lot of content. There are a number of research modules, connections modules that were created that do reference this. It doesn't have any translations, or that information would also be there. And then we also have, and with the short record, you also have the ability to actually go to the document itself, which is really what you want to do. We have all of the content marked up in XML, specifically TEI marked up for this collection. And we present all of the information in the context day by day of what's there. So we have an image of every page along with the transcription associated with that page. If I want to look specifically for yellow fever, now that I'm out here, let's see. Normally Control F would do it, but all right. So let's look for yellow fever, and it'll take us to the point in the text. Yellow fever. Okay, here we go. Yellow fever. The page that one appears on looks like page 42. And you'll see that it may look a little bit strange. Was that page 42 or 41? I think it was page 41, yeah. So we have the page image, and then we have the transcription that corresponds line to line with what's on the page image. So a scholar, as they're reading that transcription, can actually go to the page image and look at it. I wish it were sharper up here, to go back and forth between the journal and what's actually presented on the page to confirm the transcription. We also have a number of translations as well, and doing the same thing with the translation allows the scholar to catch any errors in interpretation. Since some of these materials are rather old, and some of them switch back and forth between languages, this is a really critical capability to have. So that, in summary, is a picture of what we've done with the Americas project. In doing this, we specifically were serving the needs of a group of America's scholars. Their field is a new one, and so being able to cross disciplines, where they're going across history, literature, various social studies, and then across the way these materials have been traditionally classified. You hear people talk many times about the serendipity of finding a resource. You can't get rid of the print because, gosh, look what happened when I was just browsing the shelves and picked up this book, and I never would have picked it up if I wasn't there browsing. But the serendipity that's really needed by these types of scholars and scholars who are studying new forms of knowledge, new information that's being reconceived out of older information, materials that existed a long time ago or even recently. What they need to do is not have the serendipity of the book that sits right next to them, but the ability to run through very quickly and look for materials that conceptually have what they are studying that nobody had picked up before. So it's hidden knowledge in the sense that, yeah, the book's always been there, but the particular knowledge that's now being thought about was buried. And scholars, even if you picked up the book next to it, you wouldn't have gone over to political science and picked up the book. If you were an English major that had some of this knowledge that really would have changed, your theories, your research of what you were doing. So it's been an important approach. Steve and I have talked about this as a way to take the Chinese ephemera and start to move it into this framework. And that's what we would like to do. I'll say I didn't show you any examples of where we've translated documents, but the ability to do the translations is a really key element to support the multilingual aspect of this. And then also have the educational materials available to you through the connections modules that let you then bring your research into the classroom. So it really incorporates the pedagogy, it gets it out there to your students. That's important. But the most important thing of it all is to make sure the resources are preserved long term. And that's what the Center for Digital Scholarship is here for. And that's what we do. We partner with the faculty here and with the students in helping them keep the material around a long time and even create the digital material. So let's see, go back to the PowerPoint. Click down. Since you've seen the actual demo, you don't need to see the screenshots. But just to summarize then, when you share your resources and when you collaborate, there's a lot you can do. And the impact you can have with your scholarship by putting it out there and making sure it is available long term is so much more significant than the smaller audiences that you'll reach with niche publications or targeted conferences. It will allow people you wouldn't expect to be interested in your material to find it and gain new interest. We provide that permanent access and the long-term preservation, and that's very important. And that's what we're now able to do with the Chinese ephemera materials, so that they don't get lost again, so that they don't turn into a format or live on a server that dies somewhere. One thing I didn't talk about is licensing. It is important, and it's, we spend a lot of time at the Center for Digital Scholarship working with faculty to educate them about ways they can license their material. I don't know if folks are familiar with Creative Commons, but that allows you to assign an alternative copyright to the materials. And the one we encourage authors to use is the Creative Commons BY, which is an attribution-only license, which means you can use this material, you can use this content however you want, as long as you give me credit for it. So they do need to cite you, they need to recognize that it is your work, but rather than them having to chase you down to ask permission, especially when we get into a global world, they don't have to contact you personally and say, can I use this? You're probably going to say, yeah, you can use it, because you're trying to promote the scholarship, the scholarly value of it. So by licensing these materials under Creative Commons BY license or attribution-only license, that is the most open license you can assign to this. And you retain copyright. It's not giving copyright to anybody else. All of the content that lives in our repository, the copyright belongs to the people whose digital material it is, whoever did the digitization of that material. Partnering in multidisciplinary teams, we work with the humanities faculty, the social science faculty, computer science. When we do it as a multidisciplinary team, there's a lot that gets done. I know there's a push in certain areas of the humanities to have the humanities scholars do all this themselves. Our experience has been when that happens, the results aren't the best they could be. When you work in a multidisciplinary team, really leveraging the expertise of people in those fields, the computer scientists, the information scientists working with the humanities, then the results tend to be pretty spectacular, and resources are created that can be sustained for a very long term. As I mentioned, we do plan to develop the OAAP site as a reusable framework. We're in discussions with going forward to do another proposal to IMLS to fund this as a demonstration project so that we can rework it as a framework, and then any project can just pick this up and plop their content in, do their own design overlay over it, because we feel that there's a lot of functionality, and we've had a lot of scholars express a lot of interest in picking this up and using it for their projects. So that's in sum.
Thank you.
Yes.
Questions from the audience?
I'm thinking of, I think it's called the Rice Connections Project, comparable to the MIT Open Courseware Project. How does this link together, and what other universities have interest in this model or have a model already in place?
The connections modules I talked about, that's exactly, it's the Rice Connections Project. Yeah. So those research modules, teaching modules are created in connections. That was one of the things, it was a desire for the faculty interested in doing this project, is we want some teaching or research modules created. And I'm not going to reinvent the wheel on that. Connections is a fabulous platform for creating and disseminating that knowledge. So that's what we use. A number of other projects here at Rice have approached me about using this. Certainly, we've talked with Steve about it. There's a professor in architecture, Faraz El Dada, who works with Brazilian architects, and he had a small conference workshop, I guess it was about a year and a half ago, where he brought up a number of Brazilian archives, and they're interested in this model as well. there are people in the city of Houston looking at, we've been digitizing, there's been a collaborative effort to digitize cultural resources at a number of the cultural institutions throughout Houston, and they're very interested in this model as a way to, again, pull together the resources around Houston. I've had a number of other projects related to the Americas. When they found out about the archive, they've asked if they can be included. Since we're just about ready to launch, we haven't included any beyond the initial 3, so we will start to then pull those in. The framework that we have created for this actually goes out and harvests the content from these other repositories. It doesn't pull it in and house it in our repository. It keeps it out there, but we get the metadata, and then we create the full text indices across all of these resources so that through a single interface you can do the discovery, but you are not, we're not co-opting that content.
Could I follow up on that question?
Sure.
Because I'm not quite sure. I took his question to be in part, if you took something like the MIT open course thing, say like the images of the Sino-Japanese War or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
A very famous example. And we, I mean, is it to say that the Rice open course platform would allow you to connect related materials so that you could go to the open course?
Yes.
Look at, you know, some kind of keyword like, I don't know, imperialism, and begin to access that material? Or how did...
Exactly. Let me bring that module up again. Did we have... Okay. Go to the... So, oops, okay, so this, when we go to the educational materials, we actually go out to the Connections website. So when we go there from our site, we're going directly into our set of modules. You can get to all of the Connections modules when you're there and go directly into Connections. But with ours, when we create these educational modules, there's an ability to link to absolutely anything. Let me see if I can recognize. Let's look at this particular one. Okay. Now, this may not have the external links, but in that linking framework, let's try this one. Over here, well, that's only got one. Try one more. And
you may have to read too, the display is pretty fuzzy.
Oh, all right. Yeah, I'm sorry about that. Let me see, Jose Marti may. Okay, this is a letter from Jose Marti. So this one, particular one, is in Spanish, this particular document related to Jose Marti. So it's including some of the images out of the Americas archive from our collection. But what he's done is not only linked to that, but he's linked to materials completely outside of the archive. So, you know, this is another, you know, Spanish site that he's linked to that's relevant to the materials. If OCW had relevant materials, those also could be embedded there as a link. There's no restriction on how you link.
By author in this particular case.
Pardon?
By author. It links by author in this particular case.
It could link to anything he thought was relevant to that module.
Well, that raises this other question that I had about how to put this. Well, I guess it's the webmaster, you might say, that if you have all this information, let's say, for example, you have the document in Spanish and then you have the translation. Right. Somebody looks at the translation, says that's not a good translation, and blogs in there, so to speak, you know, some correction. How do you go about correcting it? I mean,
right. At this point, if it's correction in the archive of the translation that we've done, because those do reside in the archive, there they need to actually email us and say, I think the translation should be this. And at that point, I will hand it over to the scholars to vet, and they may then bring in, likely what they'll do is bring in consultation from other colleagues of theirs to look at it, and then if they say, yep, that's right, then they will go in and change that. But within the archive, that's an archive, so it's not going to change. What they can do is create an alternative, and it would be done by somebody on the Rice side, is an alternative translation, or they can embed an additional note there in the translation. Sometimes, because the materials are so old, they're faded. So the people that were going through, the scholars going through and doing the translations, can't always tell the word. So what they would do, and this happened on a lot of materials, plus it's not modern language, it's older Filipino language even in one case. We had a document that had a lot of mixes of languages, and then trying to determine the genuine translation of a term, they would go vet this with people who were expert in that. In one case, they handed it to one of our catalogers who had to take it home to his mother. And I think his grandmother ended up looking at it and providing a proper translation. But it is possible to get the translation in, but not directly because it's a controlled archive. On the other hand, in connections, there are ways. If it's in the educational module, there are ways that you can actually go in and create your own module with the corrected information, or you can email the author of that module and say, hey, this is a mistake.
Thank you.
Yes.
Can you just open a forum for discussion, then the scholar can pick up the good ones to revise?
We had talked about doing that in the archive. It's something we want to do. It's one of those that we just didn't have the time and money to do with the initial round. But certainly we know IMLS is the funder is very interested in that kind of thing, and that's probably a next step we'll do with this, is try to attach a forum to each of the items so that that discussion can take place. It's a great idea.
Maybe one more question? Well, thank you very much. Thank you a lot, especially, I thought it was useful because what it allows for, I think, is scholars of communities of scholars based in other parts of the world to actually work together, but then also in smaller institutions who may be able to only collect part of the archive. But then also, I think, it kind of gets around some of the issues involved in who has ownership over these. Mm-hmm. And it's like, no, it's still in your place. It's just that we're able to access it from ours. And it sounds like kind of a new model, I think, for communities of scholars working together. So. Okay, we have a few minutes for a tea and coffee break to go out and recharge with caffeine and everything. So come back in about 10 minutes.